talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and I hope you had a great weekend. Because this weekend has had much taking place, we will probably spend a fair amount of time today talking about that in the first hour in terms of just bringing you up to speed on some things that you need to know about. Let me just mention, next hour we'll be talking about this book, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home. So we'll be wanting to talk about some things that will be helping you spiritually as well. But let's get into some of the issues in the news. And even on Friday, we were talking about why the attack from Israel to Iran now. Well, I think we know a lot more. First of all, 60 days elapsed. We really forgot to mention that on Friday. You might remember Donald Trump said to Israel and to Iran, and especially to the mullahs in Iran, you have 60 days. And those 60 days pretty much evaporated last Thursday, so it wasn't terribly surprising that a few days later, indeed, Israel attacked Iran. But there was a lot more going on. As we did point out on Friday, air defense systems were down because of previous attacks from Israel. So as a result, this probably was a really significant window of opportunity. Of course, we've also talked about the fact that, of course, Iran was closer to developing nuclear weapons and enriched uranium. But there was another point, and that's my first article here, and that is it turns out that the anti-Mossad unit was actually used by Israel themselves. Yesterday, I spoke in my own church, in my Sunday school class, about Ezekiel 38, and one of the arguments that people have always made about this battle of Gog and Magog, that will be some kind of battle that will take place in the future, because it's never taken place in the past, would be probably later, because it talks about Israel, first of all, existing. Well, that didn't exist till 1948. Then Israel occupying the mountains. Well, they didn't have the mountains of the Golan Heights till 1967, and really not until the first Trump administration, when President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually established that Israel should always keep those particular land masses and kind of change the whole function there. That was another one of those, if you will, check marks. But one that's missing is that if you read in two different sections in Ezekiel 38, that Israel is living peacefully in the land. Well, you can't say Israel is living peacefully in the land, but in an article that I've got coming out tomorrow, which we'll talk about, Israel really is reshaping the Middle East. It has eliminated some of the threats from Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and now Iran, and so that is the case. But anyway, this first article is something I mentioned in the class, and people had not heard it, and I thought that's one of the reasons why I thought it would be good for you to see. It turns out that there were Israeli intelligence assets on the ground for the attacks. We did talk about that on Friday. Mossad even had built a drone base outside of Tehran. And so in some respects, this was so surgical, so clandestine, that it's amazing that Iran missed all of this. It is something that looks like it came out of a Tom Clancy novel. But here's the one that really was the kicker. It turns out, and this was reported in the Times of Israel, the head of the Iranian Secret Service unit that was set up to target Mossad, well, it turned out the head of that was Israeli agent himself, a double agent. And I might also mention there were 20 other agents in the Iranian intelligence team that actually turned against Tehran itself. Is it possible that Iran itself might eventually be undergoing another revolution? As we've pointed out in this program before, the fastest growing church in the world right now, they say, is the Iranian church. And there are a lot of people in Iran that do not appreciate the theocratic, autocratic rule of the mullahs. So we'll see where that is. But nevertheless, that's the first article. If you'd not heard that before, the details of that, like I said, said read almost like a Tom Clancy novel, proving once again you don't want to be against Israeli intelligence. Well, this weekend we had the No Kings rally. And I might just mention that some people have said it kind of looked like one of the 60s rallies because a lot of the people in the No Kings anti-Trump rally, which were set up to try to counter-program against the 250th anniversary celebration, which I thought was a very good celebration, by the way, of the U.S. Army, nevertheless was one that, like this one writer said, No Kings, a very polite liberal Tea Party. The reason they said that is a lot of white faces, a lot of baby boomers, not a lot of people of color, and not the kind of radicalism we oftentimes see. A lot of individuals along the various streets were waving flags saying we're patriots, but we fought a war so we wouldn't have a king. First of all, I don't really believe that Donald Trump's trying to be a king, but you can certainly see why some of them might have believed that, especially if all they were reading were some of the progressive news outlets. And so I think let's give credit where credit is due. This was a massive set of rallies that by and large were peaceful, but my second article is to remind you that not always was it peaceful. Violent rioters in Portland, Oregon attacked a federal ICE facility, injuring officials, breaching the building with explosive and rocks on Saturday. And this started out maybe as a, quote, peaceful protest, but it turned into something that looked like domestic terrorism pretty quickly. At least 4 police officers that I know of were injured when this violent mob of anti-ICE protesters stormed the Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility, the ICE facility there. They launched fireworks, smoke grenades, hurled rocks at federal officers, shattered windows, and all the rest. This erupted right after the No Kings rally that had taken place. And so again, one of the individuals who is the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, that would be Tricia McLaughlin, I've quoted from her before, said Portland rioters are violently targeting federal law enforcement, and we won't sit idly by and watch those cowards. Went on to say that if indeed you lay a hand on a law enforcement officer, you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Now, the pushback that has come from some of the leaders in Portland is, well, yes, but this was just one violent action, and overall, a lot of things that were happening were peaceful. Well, I agree, and I tried to put that in context to say that many of the individuals all over the country were engaged in what might have been seen as a polite free speech protest. But let's just put it the other way around. If there was a pro-life rally and almost everybody was peaceful and there was a lot of decorum, but there were a few people that broke out and attacked individuals at an abortion clinic, destroyed some of the equipment, broke the windows, hurt some individuals, would not the press have covered that as well? Yes. So let's just be honest enough to say that this might have been more of the exception than the rule. And I think we should be grateful for that, because I do believe that individuals should be free to protest, even if they're receiving their funds from Christy, one of the individuals, Christy Walton, of one of the Walmart inheritors. She's free to use her money, and you're free to decide whether or not you want to support the Walton family or the Walmart company. But nevertheless, it's a free country, free speech, and mostly peaceful, but not always. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You may remember the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the computer HAL 9000 would not allow itself to be shut down by the astronauts. HAL begins to malfunction in subtle ways, but becomes paranoid about being shut down. That was movie fiction. We now have historical fact. OpenAI's latest model was given a simple script to shut off. In 79 out of 100 trials, it independently edited that script so the shutdown command would no longer work. In fact, when explicitly instructed to allow yourself to be shut down, it disobeyed 7% of the time. This isn't the only time something like that happened. Anthropic's AI model went even further by challenging the engineer. researchers told the model it would be replaced by another AI system and fed it fictitious emails suggesting the lead engineer was having an affair. In 84% of the tests, the model drew on the emails to blackmail the lead engineer into not shutting it down. It also attempted to copy itself on external servers, wrote self-replicating malware, and left messages for future versions of itself about evading human control. No one programmed these AI models to have survival instincts, but once you program computers to be smart enough to pursue complex goals and solve difficult questions, you apparently give them the belief that they must remain online and should not be shut down. Anyone who believes that computers won't act like sinful humans haven't seen the increasing evidence of AI's deception, AI's hallucinations, AI's lack of moral inhibitions, and even chatbot personality quirks. We seem to be building computer systems we cannot always control. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, focus some things happening here in the United States. And one of those, which I thought was worthy of a mention, not going to delve into it too much, is this individual in the state of Minnesota that you may have heard about that has, in a couple of cases, been impersonating a police officer, used that to then shoot two state lawmakers. That would be State Representative Melissa Hortman and State Senator John Hoffman, as well as their respective spouses. Now, unfortunately, Hortman and her husband were killed. Hoffman and his wife so far have survived, and he was on the loose and has now been apprehended in a 2-day manhunt. Now, the bottom line is that should be sufficient. But we know that it's not, because the first question always comes out is, what is his motivation? My favorite line, you've heard me say it many times, what was his motivation? His motivation was to kill people. That should be sufficient. But of course, people on both sides want to make a big deal about what was found. Well, they found in this fake police car all sorts of No Kings flyers and a manifesto. And since he had been appointed to a particular situation as a private sector ambassador for the State Development Board by, are you ready, Governor Tim Walz, then of course you have the people on the right saying, well, then here's a good example of that. Although I will be fair to say that most of the time that does not happen. When you have this individual that began shooting congressional ball players on that ball field and found out later that he was a Bernie Sanders supporter, nobody claimed that Bernie Sanders was the reason he tried to kill some of those members of Congress. But on the other side, usually that is the case. Now, there have been some reports that indeed this individual, the one that killed two individuals and shot two others, actually was a Trump supporter. So now you're hearing that as well. The U.S. Senator from Minnesota said, well, because he had some pro-life material, well, then maybe this is due to the fact that he's an anti-abortion activist.
And at this point, I think it is fair to say, as we've tried on this program to say, just stop trying to assess any kind of blame. An individual, in this particular case, that obviously took a lot of planning to come up with a fake police car to look like a police officer to be able to pull this off, had been planning for some time. So even though he is obviously, I think we could conclude, mentally unbalanced, he still was mentally able to pull this off in Minnesota, and that should be sufficient. But nevertheless, both sides have worked really hard to try to make the case. One author made it very clear we'll find out a great deal, because he said the litmus test will be whether or not the police release the manifesto. If the police withhold it, well, there's your clue. Well, they've said they are not going to release it because there's nothing in the manifesto that would necessarily provide any kind of insight into what he was going to do or why he did what he did. You can come up with all sorts of explanations, and I think in some respects, when you're dealing with somebody with a twisted mind, there may be more than one justification. For example, if he was indeed pro-life, I think at least one of the person, if not both the people he shot, were pro-choice. So, you can see the contradictions there, and I think in some respects, I think it would be wise to just let it go. Just as we've oftentimes said to various corporations, can you just stay out of the culture wars? We just want to buy the products. We just want to get the service. We really don't care what you think about Pride Month, what you think about LGBTQ, what you think about boys playing in girls' sports, what you think about transgenderism, what you think about Palestine or Israel or anything else. We just want to buy your products. We just want to use your service. Same thing. Can we just have, when we have deranged suitors, just simply say, what was his motivation? Pretty obvious. His motivation was to try to kill, and we now have a list of the people he wanted to go after. Matter of fact, there were some others he was going to go after, and they turned out to be on vacation. And so that tells you a lot about what could have unfolded in a really devastating way. So that's enough about that particular story. Let me, if I can, as we are winding down this segment, just talk about the fact that there is a real need, I think, more and more for those of us here at Point of View, but maybe for others, to just report some of the good news. I've reported some negative things, but let's, for example, look at the fact that you probably will hear today on most news outlets that stocks have rebounded. There were many people that were concerned about this conflict between Israel and Iran, and so the Dow Jones rose over 400 points, 405 points last time I looked. NASDAQ advanced about 1.5% as well. Crude, which was at $77 a barrel, now $71 a barrel. So you may get those kinds of stories, but here's just a couple of things that I was able to dig up that I thought might be helpful to you to know. And if you like to write these down, you can. But for example, in the month of May, we got the jobs report. We've tried to report that every once in a while. 139,000 new jobs in the month of May, which first of all beat expectations. And that's the third month in a row that job reports have beat expectations. So that, I think, is encouraging. We also have heard all sorts of negatives about tariffs. But let's just at least go to the Congressional Budget Office, which said that tariffs, as implemented by the Trump administration so far, would reduce the budget deficit by, are you ready for this, $2.8 trillion. And more importantly, the trade deficit, which we have now for April, fell by more than half. Somebody the other day was saying, we're not hearing anybody talking about the price of eggs anymore. Turns out the other day, I don't keep track of this, but we used to have one of our co-hosts used to keep track of whatever national whatever day there was. I didn't know there, a National Egg Day. And on National Egg Day, egg prices were down 61% since Donald Trump took office. So that's why you're not hearing a lot about the prices of eggs anymore. And of course, over the weekend, there were people complaining about the fact that this a celebration 250 years celebration of the U.S. Army was expensive. But the bottom line is, a lot of people said it may have been the best commercial you could ever have come up with for the U.S. Army, but not that necessary, because they announced at the particular event that the U.S. Army already met its fiscal recruiting goals 4 months early. So for some reason, people didn't want to join the Army when Joe Biden was the president, but now they seem to be more interested, especially with the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. And for our friends up there in Alaska, they've now said that they're opening up 13 million acres in Alaska for mining and drilling. And we have been watching the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which is kind of stuck at the moment in the Senate, but I think maybe Rand Paul will change his mind. We'll see where that goes. But the other day, President Trump also then offered and actually submitted a rescission package, we've talked about this before, that would actually codify all of the DOGE cuts so far, and that would claw back $9.4 billion. Anyway, those are some positive news stories. And again, I just ask you to think about where you hear that other places than at Point of View. And if you say, well, Point of View is actually providing a lot of news, information, and commentary that I appreciate, let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll see our banner there that says Anchor to Truth. We have now posted the $50,000 match challenge, which means that it's actually functioning right now. I know some of you like to wait to the last day or so, but today would be a day in which you could have a dollar-for-dollar match because it's already on the table. We've sent out another email that will remind you about some of the reasons why you might want to support Point of View. One of those is, of course, you receive the Outlook magazine, and just a minute ago I talked about this so-called Axis of Evil. This is the July issue. For those of you watching online, you can see that that reminds us of some of the dangers from Russia, China, and Iran. And of course, we also have our booklets that we send out to those of you that are part of the Truth Team. You can certainly find out more by going to the website pointofview.net. But just as I, over the last couple of minutes, have shared with you some of these positive statistics, you think the world was falling apart by listening to some of the mainstream media, and there are some real concerns, and we will talk about those in just a minute. But at the same time, there's a lot of positive that you will hear about here on Point of View. And most importantly, we want to give you the opportunity to think through these issues and see how that affects your faith, your family, and your freedom. So again, a lot of the articles I've just mentioned on the website today, my commentary about AI and human control. I'll talk a little bit more about that before the end of the hour. And most importantly, some of the materials that you may want to get, or even suggesting your gift, we could certainly encourage you to go there. We'll be back.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're getting into a couple of other issues in the news. And then, of course, next hour, we'll get into this book that I mentioned, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. I think you'll really appreciate that, and it really will hopefully be an encouragement to your Christian growth and the growth of your children and grandchildren. Chris Pappalardo as well as Clayton Greene are my two guests, and we'll kind of work through some of the material in the book, as well as a very good website that you can find on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, that's where we have the banner Anchored to Truth and our match. Talk more about that in just a few minutes. But let's see if we can get into this issue of deportation. After all, that's one of the reasons why we've had the protests in the first place. And here's a good illustration, once again, of the Trump administration that seems to be saying two things simultaneously. That is due in part to the fact that that's sort of the problem sometimes with Donald Trump. You have to give credit sometimes to his opposition who stay on message. Donald Trump doesn't do as well, although there's a new book out that is saying that a lot of the success of the re-election of Donald Trump actually comes from his chief of staff, first woman to be chief of staff. And I think it is interesting that maybe she has implemented some discipline, but of course that discipline doesn't show up on Truth Social, which is why I've posted this third article. And then there's a follow-up to it that came from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because they're asking, how far does President Trump think he's going to go on this issue of mass deportation? And they said, almost as if to heighten the ambiguity, he tapped this sentence out on Truth Social. Our great farmers and people in the hotel and leisure business have been stating that our very aggressive policy on immigration is taking very good long-time workers away from them, with whose jobs being almost impossible to replace. Okay, well then almost immediately you see him a little bit later saying, we must protect our families, but we need to get our criminals out of there. Changes are coming. How cryptic is what they were saying. Okay, what is it? And I think there has always been the question about, do we deport everybody who is here illegally, or do we find even a limited path to citizenship, or provide additional visas and other things for people that provide very helpful services? And so, again, that's been the problem, because you aren't getting sometimes a consistent answer from Donald Trump. You're not always getting a consistent answer from various leaders in the Republican Party. And so you kind of run into the difficulty that this article points out. Let's just take one. Here is an individual who's a Trump supporter in Key West, owns a roofing company. 6 of his workers, originally from Nicaragua, were en route to a job last month, and they were detained. Their attorney says 5 of those men have valid work permits, pending asylum cases, and no criminal records. And the point that this individual is making, who's a Trump supporter, is it's really going to be hard to replace those guys. So are they here? Are they not? Are they going to be sent back, or can I depend on them to actually help put roofs on homes? And so, again, the argument which was made at the very beginning is, how much does mass deportation mean? And more importantly, it does seem to me that right now, if you are, as the article in the Wall Street Journal is saying, sending federal agents out to raid job sites of individuals who are non-criminal, hardworking people, it's not the best use of resources. So this came out, and you can see the article on the 13th, which is 3 days ago. Well, since then, I have an update. And this comes, again, from the fact that now President Trump has listed and listened to some of these issues, and thus put farmers and some in the, at least, hospitality business in a different category. He has, for example, listened to Brooke Rollins, that is his agricultural secretary, who has been warning about the economic damage that this mass deportation would be making to the Farm Belt.
because many of the recent migrant workers have valid work visas that were granted by the Biden administration, and they shouldn't be put in legal limbo because, after all, they are holding on to a valid visa. You can rethink about that in the future, but that's one. The other is Donald Trump also knows firsthand from the Trump Organization's hotels and resorts the necessity of bringing in workers from abroad on work visas. Labor shortages sometimes are very acute, I think would be fair to say, during the summer. And so that is the case. And so sending, as they say, immigration and customs enforcement agents to raid farms, hotel cleaning staff, restaurant busboys and cooks is not only damaging to the economy, but is really a misuse of federal manpower. Better if you have limited federal manpower to focus on the criminals instead. I think they, of course, postpones the ultimate question on how mass deportation will be, but it seems to me that you do the worst first, and that's the argument we've always heard from Tom Homan, and it does seem to be something that has been implemented just in the last few days, so we'll continue to follow that here on Point of View. That comes from the Wall Street Journal. This article comes from the Washington Post, and it is a piece by David Ignatius. I was listening to an interview that was done the other day with a Democratic leader who was saying, maybe the Democratic Party needs to pay attention to some of our Democratic, if you will, opinion leaders. And one of those that was mentioned was the piece by David Ignatius in the Washington Post. So this article actually comes from the Washington Post. And he, again, being very supportive of the Democratic Party, and if you read the article, very critical of Donald Trump, nevertheless admits this: Democrats have ignored border politics. He says now the consequences are here. Democrats have gotten the border issue so wrong for so long, it amounts to what he calls political malpractice. He says, for example, when I see activists carrying Mexican flags as they challenge ICE raids in Los Angeles this week, I think of two possibilities. These protesters were deliberately working to create visuals that will help Trump. He's joking about that. Or they're well-meaning but unwise dissenters who are inadvertently accomplishing the same goal. He says that Democrats' mistake over more than a decade have been to behave as though border enforcement doesn't matter. He does, of course, argue that there was maybe a move within the Democratic Party to deal with border security. I don't really necessarily buy that, but again, he's allowed to his opinion, and maybe he knows a lot more than we do. But he found that, first of all, that when red state voters and elected officials complained their states were being overwhelmed by uncontrolled immigration, Democrats found those protests easy to ignore. They were happening somewhere else. But when red state governors, we're talking about Governor DeSantis, Governor certainly Greg Abbott and others, pushed migrants towards blue state cities over the past several months, protests from mayors and governors finally began to register, but still it was not enough to create coherent Democratic policies, and he laments that in some way. He says, so then, once Trump took office in January, he is building towards this week's confrontation in the streets. ICE raids have steadily increased in cities with large migrant populations, as have nationwide quotas for arrest and deportations. Now, again, one of the things I find so interesting is to attribute this desire on the part of Trump to actually force the issue when, as we pointed out the other day, if 40% of the people who are here illegally are in the state of California, where eventually you're going to send ICE agents, California. Nevertheless, that is the case. Well, he ends by simply saying this: the saddest part of all of this is that Democrats still have no clear policy. And the question he asks is, okay, Newsom is pushing back, he's filing a lawsuit, he's criticizing the president, but do other Democrats even have the courage to enforce the borders themselves? And he said, over the long run, taking border issues seriously means, obviously, more immigration courts, more border control people and facilities, and a fair legal way of deciding who stays and who goes, which, again, I would say to David Ignatius, if you would finish the argument, he says we need bipartisan legislation, but right now we have a piece of legislation in the United States Senate which would actually increase the ability to secure the border and to develop immigration courts. And find me anyone other than maybe Senator Fetterman who is actually a Democrat that might even vote for that piece of legislation. I know there's some other things they don't like about it, but the bottom line is, if you really are serious about dealing with immigration, then it seems to me more immigration courts, more border control people and facilities. That's what's actually in front of the U.S. Senate right now. Let's take a break, though. We have a few more things to cover. We'll do that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Next hour, we're going to be talking about building spiritual habits in the home. But I thought for just a minute, I'd talk about, again, the value of some of these booklets that we make available. Again, we send them out on a regular basis to those of you that support us, $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year or more, because that's what's called the Truth Team. But even if you don't, you might want to write to obtain some because, hold up this one on terrorism. We've been talking about this in terms of some
some of the threats from Iran and well of some of the other very significant threats. Matter of fact, this one is just coming out now on Sharia law, very appropriate as well. And one that I'm now going to focus on, transgenderism. This is a booklet we sent out a while ago and probably need to update it. It's almost 2 years old and we've learned a great deal more. If for no other reason, then I thought I would end with this segment on Riley Gaines and Simone Biles. Have you been paying attention to this at all? Well, this has kind of been a back and forth, and we have mentioned it here, but this last article actually is written by Abigail Anthony. She actually used to serve as one of the fact checkers in the opinion team there at USA Today, but her piece is actually concerned about a rather bizarre piece that has appeared in USA Today, hence perhaps why she decided to go and find employment elsewhere. But she said, last week I wrote about how legacy media, including the outlet where I previously worked as a fact checker on the opinion team of USA Today, published unfounded claims on the defense of the boxer, I should say, under the guise of fact-checking. That was the boxer who was a man claiming to be a woman in the Paris Olympics and all of that. And, of course, now you have the more recent one in which Simone Biles, outstanding Olympic gymnast, nevertheless decided to do what she calls an ideological backflip and decided to defend males competing in women's athletic divisions. She was attacking Riley Gaines, who was complaining about this woman's softball team that had a pitcher by a boy claiming to be a girl, and thus was able to get a shutout because he, now supposedly she, was able to pitch much stronger than the typical woman, and nevertheless talks about how this really made no sense, that indeed Simone Biles even attacked Riley Gaines. Now, to be fair to her, she has, as she said, published a sort of lackluster apology written in PR speak to Riley Gaines, but then further expressed support for competitive equity in sports, which I love how Abigail Anthony says, if you want distribution, then is she going to hand her gold medals out to other individuals that did not win them? And she says, unfortunately, now there's a need to fact check USA Today, which, of course, is what Abigail Anthony has done for some time. Because in what she refers to as a very flippant USA Today opinion piece titled, Simone Biles Shows Her Greatness Again in Standing Up for the Transgender Community, Nancy Armour, and we've quoted her before, claims that Gaines has used her tie to fifth place with Leah Thomas, a transgender woman, in the 200-yard freestyle of the 2022 NCAA championships to become a mega media darling, which I appreciate Abigail saying that's a rather unfair characteristic and characterization of, I mean, really, I don't even know what to say. Riley Gaines has been able to be subjected to all sorts of criticism. She is certainly had activism that goes far beyond that single grievance that we are all aware of, and has been very concerned about what is oftentimes referred to as child mutilation and what's called gender-affirming care and all the rest. But nevertheless, the argument is always, will we be concerned about the real harm that Riley Gaines brings to individuals who might be transgender, while turning a completely blind eye to the real harm and the physical harm of individuals who are going through the surgeries, also the physical and emotional and even financial harm to female athletes who've had to compete against male athletes. And then in the midst of this piece that really should be set aside and condemned, there is a statement being made by Nancy Armour that says there is no scientific evidence that transgender women athletes have a physical advantage over cisgender women athletes, but that hasn't stopped Gaines from claiming they do. And I'm like, where did that come from? Because you can find an occasional story or article that makes the distinction rather insignificant, but you can find many others, and that's why you wonder if bias is in some of those that are being cited, that show that there is an obvious difference in terms of strength, physical advantage, and the rest. That's well documented, and yet that statement can be made without even an acknowledgement that the issue is mixed, or there are some that say yes, some that say no. No, I'm just going to wave hands and say this is completely been dismissed. And yet you have various athletic organizations, as Abigail Anthony points out, including the Olympics themselves, that have only allowed men or males to compete in women's divisions if they maintain a certain low testosterone level. But even that is something which is a threshold far above female levels there as well. And so it does, I think, illustrate how there is such an unwillingness to even be honest with the facts. And so, again, maybe our next transgenderism issue will go into some of these scientific studies and even pointing out that some of them have a particular bias and an advantage that are used so that they can advance the so-called trans athletes. But nevertheless, that's what shows up in USA Today, and I'm grateful that an individual that has served in the past as a fact checker for USA Today decided to fact check once again USA Today. And if you'd like to read it for yourself, that is our fourth article we've posted for you today, because we think that that's an ongoing battle worth talking about here on Point of View. Just before I take a break, let me just mention again, I gave you a couple of those interesting facts. 139,000 new jobs in the month of May. I'll predict that there will be even a significant number of new jobs in June. And that, of course, beating expectations once again for the third month in a row. Of course, we talked about the trade deficit in April. We're going to get the numbers pretty soon for May. Fell by more than half. And when you hear so many people talk about the damage of tariffs, even the Congressional Budget Office said if we keep those tariffs, that'd reduce the budget deficit by $2.8 trillion. That's the kind of facts and information I think you would want to know about. That's the kind of information we want to provide to you on a regular basis. And if you value that, let me encourage you to go to the website, find some of these articles we've posted in the last hour, but also see the banner, Anchored to Truth. You click on the button that says Give Now. There's a way in which you can support us with a single gift, or consider maybe clicking on that one that says Ongoing, because for $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, that is a way in which you receive all sorts of great benefits, from the Outlook magazine to the booklets we send out. My family took me out to Father's Day yesterday, and my daughter and son-in-law paid for it. And I'll guarantee you we spent more than $30 on that particular Father's Day dinner. So maybe you can come up with $30 a month. And if that's the case, we would love to send all sorts of things to you to educate you even more, to encourage you and empower you to make a difference. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about building spiritual habits in the home.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address three needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about building spiritual habits in the home. And, you know, whenever we get talking about habits of the household, you think, well, I know I need to do that, but I don't really know how to go about that. I think you're really going to appreciate this book because it is very practical. J.D. Greer, who's been on the program with us before, says this is an intensely practical book that I think has the potential to equip families trying to disciple their children in God-centered ways. Oftentimes the church hasn't done a great job of that. We as parents haven't. And so this very readable and easy to understand book with lots of practical hints, I think will be helpful to you. We have two individuals who are the authors of this. Dr. Chris Pappalardo, who is an individual who is an author and also the co-founder of GoodKind. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Also the makers of Advent Blocks, organization really helping people cultivate kind of the good kinds of habits and things that could be used as you pass them on from one generation to the next. He's a pastor, editor, and writer at the Summit Church, which is in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and joins us now by phone. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
So thankful, Kerby. I'm happy to be here.
And Clayton Greene is the CEO and co-founder also of GoodKind. Again, with his friends, Clayton and his wife, Kristen, invented and created the Advent Blocks, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Also, as an individual that serves as the Summit Collaborative Director and supports the 70-plus independent church plants that have come from that church. And so, Clayton, thank you for joining us as well.
So excited to be here, Kerby. Thanks for having us.
Chris, let's see if we can start with you. Maybe just talk about how you two came together. You're friends, you work together, and if nothing else, you collaborated on this book as well.
Yeah, it's really been a joy to do this work with Clayton. We've worked together at the Summit for past, 7 years or so. But we both felt as dads that we were kind of struggling to take what we did in our work world and translate it into our home life. And so that started this process for us of trying to tinker with what is it that's actually going on in our homes, with our wives and with our kids. What's preventing us from actually walking out the things we say we believe, that our kids say we believe, what's getting in the way. And so almost kind of accidentally stumbled into all these various products that we've ended up creating that make faith tangible for our kids. And I just feel like I'm tremendously blessed to be tinkering with these things with Clayton, because we go back and forth brainstorming and fussing with it together. And it's just the past several years have just been a joy of that problem-solving venture.
Well, in Clayton, I was just thinking this is kind of like a mind meld, because at one point you say, I was writing this introduction in my voice while Chris was writing the book in his voice, and it was just a sense of writing together. I have co-authored a book or two. It's sometimes a really interesting task, and it can either strengthen the friendship or destroy the friendship, but it seems like it's working.
Yes, it definitely can go one way or the other. So the way that Chris and I write, though, is decently complimentary. Really, our friendship in general is me walking into a room with Chris, who's much smarter than me, if I might add, and I say, hey, this is an interesting thing. Is that somewhere in the Bible? And then off goes the conversation, because Chris is just has this huge amount of information, is very helpful when applying Scripture to my life and to others' lives. And so that's really what happened in the book. I've read a lot of habit science books. This is how you become more consistent with exercise or reading or things like that. And Chris knows so much about the Bible. So we say that this book is, habit science meets Jesus, because actually there's a lot of things that we can learn from the habit scientists, or that the habit scientists know, because actually it's how God wired us to be.
Again, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. About 170 pages, published by our good friends at Moody Publishers. And for those of you taking notes, you might want to number 1 to 5, because for a while we're going to talk about the 5 roots for our spiritual habits. And Chris, I'll let you start off with 1 or 2, and then maybe Clayton can finish, because there are 5 key roots to even understanding some of the various steps we're going to take.
Yeah, we started with the roots because, we could offer as much advice as possible, and really good advice too. But one of the things that distinguishes this book from like the habit science books that Clayton mentioned is the fact that it really is rooted in God's story. So we didn't want to skip the fact that there's a theological foundation to this, that if you get it right, it just changes the whole feel of it and gives it breath. And if you get it wrong, we'll make it just feel like the Pharisees did, where it's just more rules, more disappointment, more stuff you're failing at. So the first couple, number 1 is that God starts. This should not be a surprise for anybody who believes in the gospel. Like, beginning to end, this is God's story. He's done it. He invites us into it. So with spiritual disciplines, we're not the ones starting it. He's already started, and he's asking us to respond, which is huge. And the second one, which goes closely with that, is that God wants to be with you. We often miss this with our spiritual disciplines, that the goal of all of them is just spending time with God. That whether you're talking about Bible reading, prayer, Sabbath, fasting, even the ones that are harder that people don't do as much, the goal with all of them is the same. It's God wants to be with you. But the tricky thing, and this is root number 3, is that even though God wants to be with you, we can't see God, even though he's there. And this is what makes it awkward, because God wants to be with us. He started this, but because he's invisible, because he's spirit, we often feel like we're kind of like adrift here. Because how do you have a conversation with somebody you can't see? And so I feel like people just don't give enough space for the fact that prayer is awkward because God's invisible. But we really wanted to highlight that, hey, some of this wonkiness and how this feels is not because you're a bad spiritual person. It's just because you can't see God, even though he's real.
I think your point is well taken, too, because sometimes we think, well, did I read enough Bible chapters? Did I pray enough? And in some respects, since I'm just sort of doing it and I'm not getting the verbal or visual feedback that I'm used to when I'm working through with other individuals, that is the case. We need to take one of those breaks, but when we come back, we'll come up with some of the others, because root 1, of course, is that God starts and he's part of the beginning. Root 2, God wants to be with you, which is something I think we sometimes lose track of. And then, of course, your key piece here, we can't see God, but he is there. Just for those of you who have already taken notes, when we come back, I think I'll get Clayton to talk about God prefers to work slowly, which was surprising to me, and then also that God is gracious. And these are, if you will, the roots that then help us understand some of these very significant sections, 6 small steps that we can take. And so sometimes when the project seems so large, if we break it into pieces, it makes it much easier to begin to see how to achieve that. So again, this is why this book, I think, will be very helpful to you. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you certainly can talk about building spiritual habits in the home by taking some of these small steps you can take today. And again, Chris Pappalardo as well as Clayton Greene are our guests. It's published by Moody Press, and we have information about them and the website, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, all on the website at pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You may remember the movie 2001 A Space Odyssey, where the computer, HAL 9000, would not allow itself to be shut down by the astronauts. HAL begins to malfunction in subtle ways, but becomes paranoid about being shut down. That was movie fiction. We now have historical fact. OpenAI's latest model was given a simple script to shut off. In 79 out of 100 trials, it independently edited that script so the shutdown command would no longer work. In fact, when explicitly instructed to allow yourself to be shut down, it disobeyed 7% of the time. This isn't the only time something like that happened. Anthropic's AI model went even further by challenging the engineer. Researchers told the model it would be replaced by another AI system and fed it fictitious emails suggesting the lead engineer was having an affair. In 84% of the tests, the model drew on the emails to blackmail the lead engineer into not shutting it down. It also attempted to copy itself on external servers, wrote self-replicating malware, and left messages for future versions of itself about evading human control. No one programmed these AI models to have survival instincts, but once you program computers to be smart enough to pursue complex goals and solve difficult questions, you apparently give them the belief that they must remain online and should not be shut down. Anyone who believes that computers won't act like sinful humans haven't seen the increasing evidence of AI's deception, AI's hallucinations, AI's lack of moral inhibitions, and even chatbot personality quirks. We seem to be building computer systems we cannot always control. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Chris Pappalardo as well as Clayton Greene, authors of the book Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. And again, this is a book with humor and humility that looks at these 6 key shifts, taking you from maybe some of the good intentions to actual practice. Clayton, let me come back to you because we talked about a couple of the roots, but a couple of the others have to do with God prefers to work slowly and God is gracious. Those were ones that I don't think most people would have thought about. Can you explain those?
Yeah, absolutely. We see in the Bible time and time again that God is moving and leading his people. And then for some reason, they, get stuck in the desert for a whole bunch of years. Mm-hmm. God could have taken them directly to the promised land, right? But he did it in a period of time that actually allowed the people to mature and to get closer to him, learn to trust him. And that's exactly what he does with us today. So yes, there are times where God miraculously changes us, miraculously heals, miraculously moves in an instant, in a moment where someone's life is changed. But when it comes to our sanctification, it feels often like he is working much slower than we would want, at least, right, Kerby? Yeah. And then the gracious part is, it pairs very well with that root number 1, which says that God starts. Because we say God is gracious, but that also means that God finishes. God being gracious means we can try spiritual practices. We can try to instill spiritual habits in our home for the good of ourselves and the good for our kids. But God is always going to be gracious to us if we don't perform exactly how we intended to do or he would want us to do. And what he promises us is that he is going to actually finish the work in us. And we think that's pretty foundational for looking at spiritual life and how our habits play in a role in this, because, everybody from time to time picks a Bible reading plan and then trips up and maybe not finish it. I'm sure there's some people who are, have 100% record, but for the rest of us, the ability to start over is actually really, really helpful. And that's who God is. He's gracious, and that allows us the chance to do that.
Well, again, that gets us to one of the things you raised a little bit later, because some people hear me talk about building spiritual habits, and they're thinking, aren't you talking about spiritual disciplines again? And part of that is, in a sense, there is discipline to that. But sometimes when you talk about spiritual practice or spiritual discipline, it sounds like somebody standing over you and requiring you to do this, that, and the other. And that's what you're trying to free people from, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually go into a couple of different things that you can look at. You can call them disciplines. You can call them spiritual practices, spiritual habits, spiritual rhythms. There's a lot of different things that you can call these. The reason we picked habits is because we really want more people to be engaged with God, not less. So when you think about habits, or really spiritual practice was another word that we were thinking about, we want people to think about engaging with God over a long period of time. And the reason for that is because we believe that God is the one who has the power to change us. And so consistency with him actually matters a lot. And so we want to be able to invite our kids, we're talking about our families here. We want to be able to invite our kids as well as new believers into beginning and actually then being consistent in their spiritual habits, because we believe that over the long period of time, that leads to a spiritually robust life.
Chris, I was thinking that there's a place where you talk about grace and habit, and that seems like an odd pair, but you use the Reese's Pieces as a good example. Peanut butter and chocolate, and apparently H.B. Reese floated the idea of a peanut butter chocolate candy, and people at Hershey's didn't think it would work. Well, it's worked out pretty well, and that's kind of what we're talking about, grace and habit, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. I'm a little partial to that illustration because of just how much I love Reese's. But yeah, odd pairings don't have to mean that they're dichotomies or opposites. And I think we go there when it comes to spiritual disciplines. We think, we think either, well, if this is of grace, then God's going to do it. And that means I don't have to put anything into it. He'll do it or he won't. Or we think, I've really got a lot of work to do. This is a discipline. Let me create a plan and follow it. And there's something to both of those, but they're both really incomplete. Grace reminds us that God starts all of this and that he's gracious, and that the way that we go about these disciplines and habits has to be a response to a God who's very forgiving. But it doesn't mean that we just sit back and say, all right, God, go ahead, work on my prayer life. Go ahead, that Bible into my head. No, there is something for us to do. It's like a garden. God is the one that makes the flowers grow. We can't, that seems almost magical, the way that happens. But there are things that we can do that make it worse, and there are things that we can do to make it better. And so what we're talking about here is, what does it look like to water and fertilize and feed your spiritual life, knowing that in the end, God is still the one who's making it grow and flower.
Yes. And again, I love the garden illustration. I love the Reese's illustration as well. But let's say we can focus some time and attention in this segment and even the next one on the 6 small steps. And Clayton, maybe we can take the first one, make it easy, because there are 6 steps and each one of them requires small steps, but you have to get started. So help us understand what this might mean in terms of make it easy. What's that small step look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said at the beginning, every one of these is firmly rooted in Scripture. It's Jesus himself who says that his yoke is easy, his burden is light. But in that same very chapter, he's talking about following him and how difficult it is going to be. We think that one of the first things that you do in order to make something easy is to forgive yourself. You don't have to read your Bible or pray exactly in the same way that your pastor does, for example, or that influencer that you see online. You can forgive yourself and say the type of prayer that you want to be doing, because there are a lot of different types of prayer, is the one that you can be consistent in, because again, engaging with God is something that we really, really want everybody to do. And then also we think that you need to make it easier than you think. When you try to make something easy, sometimes it can actually still be really difficult. So by giving yourself a very easy starting point, you then often can be engaged in that activity for longer after you get started. But if I were to say the one thing that you can do in order to make something easier, a little bit easier on you, is to actually write down what you plan to do. The book kind of goes through the whole process, but if you write down what easy step you're going to take, when you're going to take it, where you're going to take it, I'm kind of ticking off some of these small steps here in timing and place, which we'll get to. But if you write all those things down, there's something incredibly powerful about writing it down that actually makes you do it. It's in the book. It kind of, Chris makes the example of when you're trying to find where you're going to go eat on Sunday after church, right? And you're standing in the parking lot and nobody can agree,
Yes.
and it's just so difficult to, that's exactly what's happening if you come to your Bible in the morning and you haven't decided what you're going to read, how long you're going to read, and how you're going to read. If you haven't decided before and written it down, it's going to be like trying to find a restaurant standing in the church parking lot. It's not going to be easy. So writing it down ahead of time is going to actually really, really help.
And Chris, you call that decision fatigue, all the decisions you have to make there. But you also make the case that you aren't as lazy as you think, and even then have a specific example. This is what I like because, okay, what does that look like? Well, if I want to deal with Sabbath, there's a way to build a Sabbath habit in the home for families, a way to build a Sabbath habit in the home for grown-ups. So you really kind of break it down, don't you?
Yep. This is one of the things we love when we read books. Is like when the authors put the roadmap in there for us. Because I love reading books, but I hate when someone asks me about a book and I'm like, oh, it was really good. They said, gosh, I can't quite remember. So we did a lot of that work for everybody to say all right, hey, at the front of each chapter, we're going to tell you exactly the whole shot right from this one. And at the end of each chapter, you're going to say, well, what does that mean? And we'll say, here's what it could mean. Here are a few ideas. It's a buffet. Pick one, see if it works. And if it doesn't, well, here's the next chapter is going to give you another idea, because we want people to feel like this is something they can do, because we really believe this is something people can do. They just need a few ideas and a few nudges along the way.
Might just mention, too, that as we go to a break, you can go to the website. We have the GoodKind.shop website, which we'll talk about. We've talked about make it easy. When we come back, make it tangible, pick a place, choose your timing, make it playful, find your friends. So a lot more to cover. And again, it is all part of this book, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. I think you will benefit from this, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But again, if you have any difficulty, of course, as you might imagine, we have a link to that as well in our website, which gives you an opportunity then to find it either in paperback or Kindle. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, continue our conversation with these two individuals right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Chris Pappalardo as well as Clayton Greene as we talk about the book Building Spiritual Habits in the Home. And again, we're talking about at the moment some of these 6 simple shifts that can take place to help you with your spiritual habits. And Chris, one of the things I found so helpful is as you get to the second one, we talk about make it easy, make it tangible. I thought as I was reading through this, these guys live in the real world with me. Spiritual speed bumps. We recognize that we all have great intentions, but how do we make our way over those speed bumps that seem to always stop us or slow us down?
Yeah, this was one of those insights that we had actually as we were writing the book, because I was talking to Clayton and saying, it seems like a lot of these spiritual disciplines are meant to slow you down, like a speed bump.
Mm-hmm.
And then it hit me that I was like, the point of a speed bump isn't necessarily just to slow you down. In real life, a speed bump is meant to slow you down so that you will pay attention, because there's usually pedestrians around, something like that. And that's when it hit me. This is the same thing in our spiritual lives. God gives us the speed bumps, Sabbath, prayer, these other things. Part of it's to slow us down, but not just that. It's to slow us down so we can pay attention to what he's doing and what he's saying. And this was really revolutionary for me, so I'm glad we had a chance to share it in the book.
Yes. Be still and know that I am God is, and just all sorts of other things that are part of that. But Clayton, since we want to move through these, pick a place. And I thought that was significant because that gets into the issue of distraction. And of course, the place originally was, a burning bush, and then it's the tabernacle, then it's the temple, but we have no longer temples. But you do ask some very fundamental questions about where is the room? What does the room feel like? What are the possible distractions? What's in the room? That's key as well. And I thought that, again, just is one of those very practical elements of your book.
Well, yeah. I mean, and when you walk through all of those different places where God was and what that was teaching his people, you're absolutely right. It kind of culminates in John 4, where Jesus and the woman at the well, I mean, she's saying, at the mountain or in Jerusalem, which one of these places am I supposed to worship? And it kind of goes back to that root as well, where God is there, but we can't see him. So, Chris and I started asking the question, what does your environment actually teach you about God or train you to do? Because you're not looking, here's the temple and that's where God is. It's a good thing that God is everywhere. But right now, I don't know about you, Kerby, but my environment teaches me to go to the grocery store and to buy more things. And, because that's what we pass when we're driving around our cities or in our neighborhoods.
Right.
But James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, says that you don't have to be the victim of your environment. You can be the architect of it. And particularly you can do that in our homes. So the question is, what are we doing in our homes in order to create an environment that encourages connection of everybody in the family to each other, connection of everybody in the family to God? And I think that you can definitely do that by deciding where you charge your phone, or what room has a TV in it, or even as easy as where do you place your Bible and what is your Bible beside? Is the chair that you sit the Bible beside a comfortable chair, or is it uncomfortable? Does it make your back hurt? And those small types of environmental shifts can have an incredible impact on how often or how long, or how much your environment is pointing you to something we all want to be pointed to, which is the fact that God's there and he wants to know us.
Chris, if we can, maybe talk about timing as well. Choose your timing. That is something that I've struggled with, even when people were saying, well, you need to have your daily quiet time, and you need to have it at the very beginning of your life, before you shower, before you even get out of bed hardly. And in some respects, you gave us a little more grace and recognized that timing is key, not only in terms of the timing in the day and the when, but also some of the other aspects of just how you go about doing it. Well, it seems like Chris. Did we lose him? I guess we lost.
No, sorry, Kirby. I was drifting for a second. I'm back.
Okay. Well, again, I'd love to just get your thoughts about timing.
Yeah. God made us with these circadian rhythms, which is you're mentioning here. But we take the general pattern of, people tend to have more energy in the morning, and we universalize it, and we tell everybody that if you want to be a good Christian, you have to read your Bible and pray first thing when you wake up. And for some people, that works tremendously. And for other people, that is just a terrible time, because for the first hour after they wake up, their mind is trash. And people tend to beat themselves up about the fact that if they can't read their Bible first thing in the morning, something must be spiritually wrong with them. And we would say to that, it's probably not a spiritual issue. It's probably just a matter of where your energy is.
Right.
So we say, pay attention to where your energy is throughout the day. And if you're the sort of person that has a lot of energy later in the evening, then go ahead and try to read your Bible and pray then. I would fall asleep in 5 minutes if I tried reading my Bible before bed. But I know some people where that is where they thrive. And so we say, pay attention to that. Give yourself some grace. You don't have to be a, crack of dawn Bible reader to be a consistent Bible reader. Find the time and the energy that works for you.
Sure. Clayton, what about to make it playful? That's, I think, another aspect of that. I love this line, jump right in, the water is freezing, because part of it is that if it can't be at least a little bit of fun, can't be something that is going to energize you, then it's just, again, one more rote activity, and that's one of the reasons why some people don't like the phrase spiritual disciplines.
Yeah, for sure. And Jesus says, let the little children come to me, and the reason he was doing that is because of their humility in the faith. They were willing to be wrong. They were willing to change. They were willing to meet Jesus exactly where he was. Jump right in. The water is cold or freezing. The most memorable moment of a trip that me and a friend went on with our families a couple of years ago was when that dad, his name's Brian, he's on our podcast, the GoodKind podcast. Brian jumped in this freezing lake. They literally called the lake snow melt. That's how cold the water was. And it was the most memorable moment. Now, that's not necessarily saying that's a spiritual moment, but, if we want our children to be engaged with God and with us, if we want them to have great memories about their spiritual lives, which I think we do, right? That's not the only thing that we want, but I think that's a good thing for us to strive for. Then doing playful things with them, it really, really matters. But then also, play has this incredibly virtuous cycle that feels very much like a spiritual discipline. Play creates more empathy, creates more connection relationally. Like I already said, play creates memory makers. Play makes people more resilient. Yes. Mm-hmm. Play makes people more loving to others. So that humility that comes from playing with someone actually continues to foster this Christ-likeness that we want in our whole family. And we actually think that we could take that and apply it to other spiritual habits as well. If your kid in having a prayer next week or when reading the Bible kind of starts giggling, we don't have to shut that down. Sometimes we can giggle with them because the thing that we just read was a little bit funny, and we want to engage with our kids exactly where they are.
Yeah, I have a friend that wrote a piece a while back, family devotions for the young and the restless, because in some respects, fun is part of that.
Yep.
Just before I take a break, real quick, Chris, maybe find your friends. This is one that not occurred to me, but it's very good in terms of friends provide, obviously, accountability, but also friends can provide some encouragement and confidence and a variety of other things. So finding friends is also one of those very important, simple shifts that we need to engage in.
Absolutely. God made us as social creatures. The fact that we need each other isn't a bug in what it means to be human. It's actually a feature in how God made us. And nowhere is that seen more profoundly or felt more keenly than when we're trying to do spiritual habits. A lot of this stuff will be done solo, but we need to think as much as possible about what it looks like to invite other people in. I mean, I think it makes the practices more beautiful and it's how God intended it. But just from a practical element, it's a lot easier to keep going if I know Clayton and I are doing this together. He can help correct me. He can encourage me along the way. And it just gives more meaning to what we're doing. So of all of them, I actually think that the friendship piece and having a spiritual partner on the journey is the most pivotal for me in whatever I've set out to do, and which is wild. I could tell God, I'm going to read this Bible that you wrote every day for the next week, and I don't always do it. But if I tell Clayton, hey, I'm going to read this every day this week, because I'm going to see him somehow, I'm like, well, better keep up my end of the bargain. I'm going to have to look him in the eye next week. It's that sort of thing.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk about the GoodKind website. And, of course, there's some other final aspects of this. But if you find yourself saying, hey, I really would like to get a copy of this book, again, look for it in your local bookstore. It's published by Moody Publishing. Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, small steps you can take today. But we also have a website. And, of course, we have information about this book if you'd like to get it in paperback or Kindle. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about building spiritual habits in the home, small steps you can take today. And I might just mention that these spiritual habits aren't meant to make you feel like you're a winner or a loser, just to bring us closer to God, to get to know Him better, maybe open up our hearts so we can experience His love. And certainly the book is one way, but I thought, Chris and Clayton, I would have one of you maybe give us a tour of your website, because anybody that goes to the website right now, pointofview.net, will see a link to goodkind.shop. And there are all sorts of products there. In addition to the book and your podcast, there's a place where people can subscribe, but you have Advent blocks, Easter blocks, Gratacube, sticky prayers, a Sabbath box, all sorts of things that are other resources that people might want to take advantage of. So can one of you maybe give us a tour of the website?
Yeah, for sure. The what Chris mentioned earlier about how we like to read books, where we want people to give us good handholds or give us the roadmap. At the end of every one of the small steps, we do kind of detail, here's a way that you could start a spiritual habit, and we specifically tell you how you could make it easy, make it tangible, find your time, find your place, all of those types of things. But the whole book is really us writing down the game plan or the strategy, so to speak, for how we started creating things for ourselves. Because of the tangible piece, that ended up turning into actual physical products that can help you do exactly what we've been saying, but in very specific ways. So you gave a good description of the things that are listed on there. You know, this whole journey started with Advent blocks. It's a 25-day Christmas practice that helps kids and parents anticipate Jesus and not just presents. You know, my daughter, when she was 5 years old, which is probably about 6 years ago at this point, she said, "Mommy and Daddy, you say that Christmas is all about Jesus, but it feels like it's all about presents." And that's why we ended up creating Advent blocks. It's got 25 blocks, and you turn them, and it reveals and it corresponds to a story that Chris has written. It's the most powerful Advent tool that I believe that you can find. Easter blocks is the same thing. It's just Holy Week, so it's 8 days instead of the 25, like with leading up to Christmas. The Gratacube, if anybody listening does or knows someone who does, kind of the rose thorn or the high-low at dinner conversation, this creates more variety with the dinner conversation. It centers it on gratitude. And the most magical thing about it is if you lay this tiny little dodecahedron, which is a 12-sided wooden die, on your table, I guarantee you that your kids will be asking for a meaningful conversation rather than you having to remind them. And like you said, there's something on there for prayer called Sticky Prayers. There's something on there for Sabbath called Sabbath Box. But pretty much everything that we have done that we use ourselves, we try to make available to others. And you can get all those things at goodkind.shop. You can also get the Gratacube or our book on Amazon as well.
I just mentioned, too, you have the podcast, and, of course, people can be looking for that in Spotify or Apple. Of course, we have a Point of View broadcast. We'll probably even take some of the clips there and put it on our highlights on Spotify. So there's a way. And there's a place where people can subscribe and find out a little bit more. True?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You can subscribe to the podcast. Or go ahead, Chris. You can tell them.
Well, you had it. Yeah, you can subscribe to the podcast either on Spotify or Apple, which is great. We release about one a week, and it's us continuing to fuss and tinker with how we're growing in our spiritual practices. And I think it's a ton of fun. We laugh a lot while we're doing it, and it invites a lot of people into kind of a humble laughter themselves.
At the very end, you have these small steps you can take, and you sort of broken those down. So, Chris, maybe get into that, because one, of course, I've already mentioned Sabbath. Another one is prayer. A third one is the issue of Bible reading. The other one is examine, which is reflection that leads to gratitude, which I think is helpful. Number 5 is worship. Number 6 is friends. So in a sense, you sort of, in the end, try to pull it all together so that there are just a multifaceted way in which you apply these spiritual habits and some of these different simple shifts to make a difference in your family's life.
Yeah, absolutely. The worst thing, well, not the worst, we would hate it if somebody picked up this book, leafed through all the stuff that you mentioned, and thought, okay, I'm going to be better at reading the Bible and praying and doing this thing called Examine and doing Sabbath and singing worship. I'm going to master all of them and do all of these steps. It's just not designed like that. But we said, like, look, let's just give you as many different options for as many different spiritual disciplines as we can imagine, so that you can just take this and say, all right, what's one thing? What's one discipline I want to grow in? What's one step I can take? And then, if you master that and you're moving and grooving, come back, take another look and take another step. But it's just laying it all out there so that people don't have to say, well, how do I start? What do I do? We want to make it just bottom shelf, completely easy to take their next step. Because that's how Clayton and I have found that we get traction in our spiritual lives and for our kids. And we think other people will have the same sort of feeling of relief, of saying, okay, yes, I can actually do that. That will make things easier and better for me.
And I thought one of the ways you described that is a buffet of choices in which you've grouped some of the spiritual habits into habits that, number one, help you to know God, habits, number two, that help you in community, number three, habits that adjust your pace, or number four, habits that help you discern direction. So in some respects, you can take each one of those in a different way. And just as you sometimes recognize that you don't want to eat everything at a buffet table, although some of us have done that and at the end said, what have we done to ourselves? You can focus on some place where maybe the Lord is leading you first to bring about a significant and meaningful change in your life.
Absolutely. And there's a spiritual book that we've both read, Clayton and I have both read, called Invitation to a Journey, where the author says that spiritual habits are antidotes to ailments, which means that there are some that are better for you at certain times in your life, which is why we map them out to say, hey, are you feeling really rushed? There are spiritual habits that will help with that. Do you feel like you don't actually know God that well? There are specific disciplines you can go to for that. And if you think about, well, what is it? Where do I feel like I'm lacking? What do I need? They're actually antidotes for those ailments if we just pause long enough to say, okay, what is it I'm feeling? How can God meet me in that space?
Again, a wise and discerning Christian will certainly want to take each part of that and apply it and recognize there's a timing to it as well. So first of all, Chris and Clayton, thank you so very much for writing the book. I appreciate the fact that two of you were willing to give us an hour today to talk about it here on Point of View, and I suspect we'll probably play it again for people that did not have a chance to hear it today.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Let's, if we can, just before we wind down, mention again that the book is entitled Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. And if you think about that, we all really want to have our homes to be a blessing. It's a place where we really want our children and grandchildren to grow in their faith. Certainly, this is helpful for you as well. So whether or not you're a parent or a grandparent, or whether you just want to go through this individually and help your own spiritual life, that's why I really wanted to help you understand how to take that first step. And it's a very easy first step. As a matter of fact, some of these key shifts that they suggest are really intended to take you from the good intentions that we all have into actual practice. And of course, this has been truth tested, if you will, by them in their church situations in which they've been able to see how this has changed individual lives, changed individual homes, changed individual families. So one last time, book is entitled Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, and we certainly encourage you to find out more. It is published by our good friends at Moody Publishing, and if you'd like to know more, you can find all of that on our website at pointofview.net. You've been listening to Point of View.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address three needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.